Alright guys, welcome back to What Could Go Wrong. So today I'm going to do another tier list video. I'm going to do all of the tanks, all of the healers, and then all of the DPS. But I'm going to do it a little bit different than I did yesterday, just so it's a little less complex and a little less confusing. I'm going to go through each spec individually, and I'm going to give each um, type of spec its own tier list, right? So break down the tier list. So S tier up here at the top is going to be always invite. As soon as they apply, just take them. Okay. A tier is going to be your best choice, but if there's another alternative in the S tier, you should go with that. But A tier is pretty much your second best. Like if they apply, they're a solid choice. B tier is going to be they're a good tank, but they have an issue, or they're a good healer, but they have some issues. They're a good DPS, but so B tier is going to be really good, but okay. C tier is going to be your um they're okay. Maybe don't prioritize them, but like they're all right. And then F tier is going to be don't even waste your time. All right. So, with that being said, starting off with Blood Death Knight. So I'm going to put Blood Death Knight into B tier because they're really good tanks. They're very self-sustaining. They keep themselves alive. They do really, really well, but they have a lot of survivability issues right out the gate. So at the very start of the pull, things can be a little bit tough until they start getting everything rotated. They get those first like probably 3 or 4 GCDs going. It's a little bit rough. Um, But all in all, a really good tank. So Brewmaster Monk is next. Put them in C tier. Brewmaster is just very squishy. They very often are killed by melee attacks. They're very hard to heal. They do a lot to keep themselves alive, but at the same time, like they also kind of struggle just in general, really. In all, good tanks, but they're just not quite there yet, right? Guardian Druid. B tier tank as well. They're really good, but when it comes to magic damage, they suffer. They're very self reliant. They have a lot of self healing. They do a lot to preserve themselves. They do a lot to mitigate their damage. They do a lot, but when magic damage starts flying, they're not super great. Um, Definitely a solid tank. Probably not quite above Blood Death Knight, but all in all, they're solid tanks, and you should definitely consider Guardian Druid if you get them in your group. Vengeance, I'm gonna put it at the top of C tier. Vengeance really has like tanky windows. They need their Fell Devastation up, they need Metamorphosis up, and they need to be able to rotate their cooldowns throughout the pull. Um, in reality, the way the nerfs have worked with Vengeance is they took a lot of hard hits, they took a lot of struggles, but all in all, they're a good tank. They're just very, very difficult, and they're hit or miss. I did a key last night with a really good Vengeance Demon Hunter, but I've also done other keys where it was like, okay, why did I take this tank? Right? So, in all, C tier overall. Protection Paladin, I'm going to put him at A tier, right? I get it, they're the meta. Got it. But, all in all, Protection Paladin is really good at interrupts. They're really good at self sustain. They're really good at armor. But I've also seen them go squish really, really fast. So from what I'm seeing is Protection Paladin is really good inside their cooldowns. Otherwise, not so much. They don't necessarily rely on the group so much for interrupts and silences and things like that. But they're also hitting a point where if their holy power isn't triggering it like it's supposed to, if they miss a GCD, if they do something wrong, they can die very, very quickly and very, very easily, right? And last but not least, we have Protection Warrior. So Prot Warrior, in all, is a very, very good tank. It is easily one of the better options that you have. The biggest issue you run into with Protection Warrior is still they have threat problems. Did a key last night with my Protection Warrior, and there was one pull It was like an accidental, like, chain pull type situation. Somebody jumped into her, they were moved to the wrong spot. I forget exactly what happened, but I had a really hard time getting aggro back from them, um, outside of, like, my mass taunts, and then even then, their threat was already up there, and it was more than mine, and trying to get my threat out. It was incredibly difficult to deal with that. So I think Protection Warrior rather has something to deal with everything and something for every situation, but I also think that they have to be incredibly careful because if they lose threat, like it could be really, really bad, especially if you're doing a big pull, right? So this is my ranking for all of the tanks. I really only use one template for tier list, so that's why I'm doing all three of them. But with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and move all the tanks out of here as advertised, giving each type of specialization their own tier list. So next up is going to be healers. All right, starting with Discipline Priest. So I'm going to put Discipline in A tier, following our same system. I think Discipline does really, really well. I think that inevitably they have a lot to deal with, a lot of different things, but one, they're still a cloth healer, so they're gonna be squishy. Two, they don't have any like major heals outside of Ultimate Penance, and with them losing Rapture, I mean, running Rapture right now is great. It can get your barriers out for people, but I think in all, they're just not quite the S tier that people think they are, and I think that they have those one or two problems. A big problem that I see with Discipline Priest and that I know Discipline has is they don't have an interrupt at all. There's no interrupt for them to go with. And I think that really, really hurts them as a healer in general. Um, moving on, Preservation. So, Preservation, B tier spec, easily. Phenomenal healer, great bursts of healing, good throughput, but they lack that one-on-one healing when it comes to every other spec. So I think that in general, Preservation has the ability to be good, and I think that Preservation could be a top healer if their single target healing looked a little bit better. I think a lot of times, especially in the current Mythic Plus, you don't need mass group healing. You need just some bursty single target healing. And I think that is ultimately what they're lacking, and that's what's keeping them from A tier, right? And the fact that they bring Lust makes them a phenomenal healer to have. They have Lust and an interrupt, multiple interrupts. That makes them a quality healer, but without that single target healing, they're gonna struggle, right? Holy Paladin. S tier all the way. All right. I I have never personally played Holy Paladin. Okay. But I've run with so many Holy Paladins this season. I've done so much with Holy Paladins. They are insanely good healers. They have strong throughput. They have strong damage. They're tanky. They have an interrupt. They have a silence. They have CCs. They have cleanses. Like Holy Paladin, at the end of the day, Holy Paladin is the full package. And I think that if if Holy Paladin got a closer look, and I think that if people realize just what Holy Paladins can do, I think that a lot more people would be playing Holy Paladin. And I think that Holy Paladin would probably be the meta healer. They are just that good. But again, that's my unbiased opinion. So moving on to Holy. Holy is going to be a C tier healer, right? The reason why I say this is because they have the throughput, they have the numbers to keep up, but they have huge mana problems. They have no interrupt. Um they have the cleanses, they have all of that, but they have no AoE to deal with help deal with affixes when the group is trying to deal with damage and focus on the combat. They have panic heals, and they have strong heals, they have weak heals, but just overall, compared to the other healers, they're just not doing that great. They're not very um I'm trying to think of the word. I guess they're just not quite up to par with the other healers in the game, right? Moving on to Mistweaver Monk. So I'm going to put Mistweaver in A tier with Discipline. So the reason why I would put them into Discipline or into A tier with Discipline is they have very good throughput. They have very bursty heals. They are very tanky. Um, they have an interrupt that they're able to do. They have crowd control that they can do. They can do a lot for the group. The utility of a monk in general is just out of this world, right? And I actually think I'm gonna move them. Yeah, I'm gonna put them at the top of the A tiers because I would take a holy paladin or a Mistweaver monk before I took a disciplined priest. Um, so I think that Mistweaver as a healer, Mistweaver is phenomenal. I think the reason why that they could never be a meta healer and why they could never be in the S tier um, is simply based off the fact that when when you need a lot of damage stops and when you need a lot done all at once, uh, Mistweaver is kind of just lacking a little bit in the there's a lot going on all at one time. I need to be careful. They also struggle with ranged comps. So I think that they're a great healer. I think that they're a great choice to take. I think they would do well with whatever healer you want. But I think the problem that you're going to run into with a Mistweaver monk is simply the higher you go, the more damage that comes through, the more difficult time they're going to have, right? So moving on to Restoration Shaman. So I'm going to put Restoration Shaman at the top of, well, maybe, come on, the top of the B tiers here. Let's just do it that way. So I'm going to put Resto Druid, excuse me, Restoration Druid. I'm going to put at the top of the B tier. I think the only thing holding them back from A tier is simply the fact that their heals just feel very, very weak, and it feels like you very much have to focus on what all you need to do. And I think that if you mess up too much or if you don't stay on top of the healing and if you can't predict that damage coming in, if somebody takes that oh no damage, I think that druids are going to struggle with that, right? I think Resto Druid is a great option to take. I think it will get you through many keys. I've run with several keys with them, and they're great. But their heals just feel very, very weak, especially if you get behind. So, all in all, though, like a druid utility is very, very good. It is amazing. So, you can't argue with utility purposes. And I think if their heals felt a little bit stronger and if they weren't as predictive, I think that they would do all right to be an A tier. But I think they just need their heals just need to be stronger. That's really what I see. Restoration Shaman. I'm gonna put it at the bottom of S tier. So I understand like it was a meta healer, they got some nerfs, they've dropped down, they're great. The one thing that I've seen about Resto Shamans, they have something for everything. Doesn't matter what happens, doesn't matter what the situation is, they can solve the problem and it's fine. They have poisons. Okay, we have something to deal with that. You need a dispel, have something for that. You need extra healing, got something with that. You need to worry about a ranged comp over a melee comp. You've got stuff to deal with that. You've got totems that you can throw out. Oh, you have a ranged DPS. Just keep that healing stream totem over there by that ranged DPS and then worry about keeping the rest of the group alive. They have unique abilities to deal with everything. And I think that you mix that with their ability to deal with any type of situation, or you add their ability to deal with anything mixed with their throughput, mixed with the shaman utility in general. I think that they're undeniably an S tier healer, and I think that undeniably they should be fighting with Holy Paladin to be the meta every season, right? Well, maybe not every season because I know every healer has some struggles, but I think that shaman should be fighting with Holy Paladins to be the meta, right? So before I get into the DPS, um, I am going to say that this is 110% opinionated. What I personally think from either playing the specs, from seeing the specs being played, or just hearing other content creators talking about the spec. All right. So I've played a lot of Protection Paladin, so I haven't really played a whole lot of Arms or Fury. However, I'm gonna put Fury into, or excuse me, I'm gonna put Arms into B and Fury into A. I think that the primary issue I think the primary issue that you run into with excuse me, sorry, my phone started ringing. So I think the primary issue you run into with warriors is they don't bring a whole lot to the group. It's the same for protection warrior as it is for fury and arms. But I think that fury has the tankiness to keep up, and fury is able to do a little bit of self healing to offset, and their damage profile is insane. Arms, I feel like they have the tankiness, they have the little bit of self healing they can do here and there, depending on how you talent. But I don't feel like their damage profile is just good enough. It's not good enough for them to be a spec that you would want to have in your group. But I also don't think it's bad enough that you would just kind of want to not ignore them, but run with them less often, right? So moving on to rogue specs. So assassination, S tier. Subtlety, I would put in a C tier, and outlaw, I would put in a B tier. Now, the reason why I put assassination into S tier is the sheer amount of utility that they bring. The silence, the bleeds, the spatters, the skips, like they just do so much to help the group, and they are just undeniably a phenomenal spec. Outlaw, I think that Outlaw does okay, that you've got all the traditional rogue utility, but I don't think their damage is quite there anymore to want to jump them into A or S tier. Subtlety, I feel like with Subtlety, all you're bringing is a rogue spec. That's it. That's all there is to it, right? So moving on to Hunters. So I would put Marksmanship into B tier. I would put Survival into A tier, and I would put Beast Mastery into C tier. I'm going to put Beast Mastery just above Subtlety, though, and I'll explain why in just a second. So starting off with Survival. So Survival, I was doing a key last night on my Survival, super under geared, and I was keeping up in the damage. There were times that I was smoking damage over 1,000,000. Plus, you bring Hunter utility. Plus, you bring a pet, so you've got Lust. You've got an extra defensive. You've got whatever you need to keep up, you've got it all there. And I think similarly with warriors, I think marksmanship is a great option to bring, and I think they're a great option to have. However, I don't think marksmanship has the damage to be an S tier. And I think that is the only separation between survival and marksmanship right now is marksmanship's damage is just not quite where it should be, right? Beast mastery, yes, they bring a lust pet. Yes, they do really well. They do all right. They keep up. They have the hunter utility, but their damage profile just isn't really that great. I've been doing a couple runs and I've purposefully taken some Beast Mastery Hunters, and I've noticed they're not really topping the meters. They're not keeping up with the other specs. And I think that that is a huge issue. And I think without the damage profile, utility is useless, right? Havoc. I'm gonna put Havoc at the bottom of C tier, because they're great in situations, but they're not that great. They bring some utility, but not a lot of utility. They require certain comp to be super effective, and you have to build around them. And I think unless you're maining a Havoc Demon Hunter, I don't think you're really gonna excel in keys. Druids. So Feral, I think I'd put Feral at the bottom of C tier, and I would put of B tier, excuse me, and I put balance in the middle here. So Feral in general does really well. It's keeping up, but it's a lot of pre-coordination. It's a lot of keeping up with what you're doing. It's a lot of like perfectionist play. And I think that limits the ability to really just be successful if you have to have a perfect rotation. I think that that can create issues. Balance, I think balance really just needs the tank to understand how it plays and to be able to pull around their cooldowns, around how they're doing things, all of that fun stuff. And I think that with that level of coordination from your tank, doesn't really matter what druid utility you have. It doesn't really matter what extra abilities you can do. Like if the tank has to pull specifically around you, I think that limits you and will prevent you from being an A tier. Frost and Unholy. So I'm gonna put Frost in A tier, and I'm gonna put Unholy just above it. So similarly, they have the same utility, they have the same abilities, they have like a lot of success, and they both have really good damage profiles. But I think what sets them apart is Unholy is pug friendly. Frost, less so. Okay. I think Frost requires coordination, but is still successful without it. But in order for Frost Death Knight to truly be successful, the tank has to know what he's doing with that Frost DK. Unholy does not require that, and I think that's the only separation for those two. Devastation. I'm gonna put Devastation just above. I'm gonna put it just behind Outlaw, and I'll put Augmentation to A tier. So uh, Augmentation is great in high keys. It's super great once you start pushing past, I would say, 12s. But before a 12, you don't need an Augmentation Evoker. You don't need them to be successful, and that's what prevents them from being S tier. And I would even venture so far as to move them to the top of A tier because they do provide assistance. They are good to bring along, but you don't need them to be successful, right? Devastation. Oh wow. Um, so I've actually played a lot of Devastation. I've messed around with my evoker quite a bit. I've run keys in preservation and devastation, and I think the problem devastation has is they're just too squishy to be an A tier spec. I think they do really good damage. I think that they are really, really a phenomenal spec as a whole, but they're not as tanky as rogues or warriors, and that's I think the biggest issue, right? So I think if we could get a little bit of changes to the way that or the tankiness of the spec, I think that they would be in a much better position. I think they would do much better as a whole. All right. So Retribution Paladin. I think Rep Pally does really well, and I think they do offer a lot of group utility. I think I would put them at the bottom of S tier. Their damage profile alone makes them an A tier. Even if you take out all the paladin utility, it really just makes them an A tier spec. I think when you look at the amount of utility a paladin can bring with Blessing of Freedoms, with bubbles, with interrupts, with crowd controls, with silences, like they're a phenomenal spec as a whole. And I think that Rep Paladin is a clear S choice just because of utility and damage, and it's so, so nice to have one of them in the group. Shadow Priest, I'm gonna put it at the put him at the top of C tier. So their damage is not great, but it's good. The utility they bring, priest utility is gonna be there, but I just don't think they're outshining anybody. I don't think they're doing anything to set themselves apart from the other DPS. I think that they're just slightly better than these other 3 C tier specs solely based off of the fact that they bring you more utility and they bring a decent damage profile that is just slightly better. Next, we've got Windwalker Monk. So a Windwalker Monk is probably just above Feral Druid. So you've Monk utility, like I said earlier, is just phenomenal. The damage that Windwalker has the ability to do is insane. It's crazy. So I wouldn't say that they're going to compete for an A tier spec. I would say that they're definitely B tier. Having them along is nice, but I wouldn't plan my day around them. Um, I think that in general they have the potential to be a phenomenal spec, but I also think that there are a lot of ways that they could be improved upon. Next up is going to be the Warlock specs. So I would put Demonology, yeah, just below Shadow. Put Affliction, the very just behind Feral, and I would put Destruction right about here. So Demonology is just not very common. You don't really see a whole lot of Demonology Warlocks. Um, their damage is okay. Their utility is okay. They're okay. Like they're not great. They're not somebody I would try to invite. They're not a spec that I would want in my comp. Um, Affliction Affliction does really well, and they've got good utility. They've got good damage. They're just they're decent, right? They're not great, but they're also not terrible. I think their damage is slightly better than Demonology, and I think that the amount of ignore what's throw my dots out and ignore everything while I do group utility that Affliction has, I think that is a huge determining factor. Destruction Warlock. I think the biggest determining factor is they are tankier than Devastation. They have a better damage profile than all of these. They have better utility. They are just all in all. I think when it comes right down to it, I think what's keeping them from A tier is that they're just not as um they're just not as good. They don't offer nearly as much, right? I think that if their damage was a little better, if their utility was a little better, if they just had something else, I think that would jump them to A tier very easily. Mage specs. So I said this yesterday and I'm going to say it again today. I am putting all the mage specs in S tier and I would rank them as such. Reason why I do this, mage utility is you have a group wide defensive, you have personal defensive, you have alter time for when you know something's coming. You have the ability to shield yourself, and then you can shield the group, and then you shield yourself again. You can burst damage. You can sustain damage. You can do AOE. You can do single target. You can do it all as a mage. And I think that mages are very underappreciated. And I think that the only thing that keeps a mage from being an S tier spec every season is just their survivability and the fact that they are the squishiest of the DPS. Um, I think that they could use a little more tankiness, and I think if they got a little bit of tankiness, then that would change the dynamic of how they're played and how often they're played and how often they're brought, right? So shaman, I'm gonna put enhancement at the yeah, I'll put him in the right here, and I'll put elemental just above augmentation. So I put enhancement into S tier not because it's meta, but because it has a damage profile that is unmatched. It has utility that is unmatched. It's got single target, it's got AoE, it's got multiple different builds, it's got combined builds, it's got eh, so many different options, and it's just a great spec as a whole. But I think that what keeps it behind the other two specs is the tankiness of how shamans are in general. And actually, now that I think about it, I think I want to do that because Ret has a little bit better damage and it's got better survivability than Assassination does. But back to enhancement. Enhancement it's just such a unique spec, and I think if they were slightly more tanky, they would be the perfect class. I think that you could very easily create a combo with probably a protection warrior, a holy paladin, a ret paladin, an assassination rogue, an enhancement shaman, or I think you could definitely alternate your retribution paladin with any of the mage specs. And I think that that would be a comp worth digging into. And if I had the friends who did that, I would definitely build a comp around these 4 specs. I would have a prot warrior, I would have a holy paladin, and then I would probably definitely bring a assassination rogue and an enhancement shaman. And I would alternate to see what does the comp work better with. Do we have having arranged, does that help our comp? Does that hurt our comp? Or is it okay? Is Ret Paladin better? Having the 3 melee, is it good? Or just having the ability to interchange based off the dungeon. I think that is a huge deal, and I think that changes the game. And I think these 4 DPS specs in the top are by far game changers that people sleep on a lot. Elemental Shaman. I think the only thing that keeps Elemental out of S tier is solely the fact that their single target damage seems to be somewhat lacking. Now, this could just be my personal opinions. This could just be what I've personally seen, but I haven't really seen a elemental shaman push the same numbers as these other 4 DPS specs and also keep up their utility, right? So I think at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, if Elemental had a little bit better single target, I think they would be there. I think you could very easily put them at the bottom of S tier and they'd be okay. But in general, this is pretty much how I would rank all the DPS specs. You will notice, okay, I did not put anything, any of the 3 classifications, I did not put anything into F tier. Nothing. Because there's not a single spec in this game that you cannot run with and be successful. Are there are there groups that will require more coordination? Yeah, absolutely. If you're running monk, a holy priest, a subtlety rogue, a beast mastery hunter, and shadow priest, are you gonna have to think about things a little bit more? Yes, but you can still do it. And I think that's what a lot of people are forgetting, especially with the difficulty of the current season, is we see these tier lists and we see what would be required. And in general, I think that any spec is capable of pushing this high end concept. I think if groups would sit back and stop, excuse me, sorry, ignore my yawns. But I think that if groups would step back and stop looking at like, oh, what's meta? What's going to be the best? What's the best? What's the best? What's the best? And I think if they would sit there and they would look at it as like, okay, what are we willing to play? What are we going to enjoy? And they just play what they enjoyed, and they would sit back and they would think, okay, we need to have a cleanse, we need to have a lust, we need to have onesie twosie things. That's it. And I think that at the end of the day, more often than not, people get caught up in the meta. Okay. I said it just a second ago, but for instance, if I could run a comp that looked like this, and we'll just say this, right? So this would be great. I think that you could go far with this type of a comp. I think that this type of group would go crazy, and I think that they would push breaking the meta very easily. And even if you take this out and you put, just say, put an arcane mage or a frost mage or any of those, I think you could go places with this group. I think this group would go places. I think this group would go places. I think this group would go places. So don't get fixated on the tier list. Don't get fixated on the way that I ranked everything. That's just personal opinions, what I've seen so far, and what I think everything is doing right now. But with that being said, go out there, have fun, enjoy the game, create your own comps, have a great time, and always remember what could possibly go wrong.